Now with us this morning to review the papers, the TV presenter Sarah Kaywood and US political analyst Dr. James Boys. Welcome back to you. We're starting with politics and American politics. What else? The election, it's imminent. And James, you had a look at the Daily Mail. Why hurricane-made Obama fans think Jesus is a Democrat.
Well, this is interesting. I picked this up because it's fascinating. Sir Chris Mayer, our former man in D.C., has put this piece in here. He was meant to take part in a debate that I was engaged in last week for Intelligence Squared. Would Jesus vote Democrat? 400 Guardian readers turned up for this debate, and I thought I would challenge this, so I decided I would suggest that he would be a Republican. And I managed to get 35 votes that night, so completely failed. But this lovely idea that we in Europe think that Democrats and Republicans are of a certain ilk and comparable to the Republicans and the Labour and the Conservative Party over here. And of course there are great differences, and we need to recognise that, I think. But feeding into this also this idea that this election could be decided by the lawyers. This is getting so close. We spoke an hour ago about how things are turning out over there, how close they are. And there's no doubt that if this goes to the wire, as it could do, we might not even get a result on Tuesday night, because this could be lawyered out, just as it was in 2000, if we're not careful. And it's interesting the way that American politics is becoming more and more entrenched, and yet the results are getting closer and closer. So,
and how long could it be spun out for?
You remember 2000? Weeks. I don't think it's going. I wouldn't be surprised if we do get something sorted out, but there's the potential, as we spoke about earlier on, for this being dragged out throughout the courts if we're not careful, especially in Ohio.
Coming back to the is Jesus a Democrat? Yeah. Religion does play a part in American politics in a way that it doesn't here. Why is that?
It does, and it's fascinating because there's such great tensions in the United States, but there is a fundamental belief there that if you don't espouse religion as a candidate, you can't get elected dog catcher. I know on the Sky News for iPad app that needs some work on, Dominic Waghorn, I think, has got a piece on there, and talking very much about how you've got to, wear God on your sleeve. You can't get away with what Alistair Campbell said here many years ago, which is we don't do God in this country, and this idea that you can't be too religious in America. But it's fascinating. No one's really talking about Mitt Romney's Mormonism this time round.
No, I was going to say, he's managed to steer clear of that, which isn't the sort of traditional idea of religion that most Americans hold.
It is remarkable. You go back to 1960, for example, and John F. Kennedy has to travel all the way to Houston to give a major keynote address about him being not the Catholic candidate for president, but being the Democratic candidate who happens to be Catholic. And we've come a long way since then, and I think that's a good thing.
And I think they both actually steered clear of religion, haven't they? Obama also. I mean, there's some who don't even believe that he's a Christian at all.
Absolutely.
But neither of them seem to have mentioned it.
They haven't, but they've not really touched upon a lot of politics either.
Come at it from an angle. I mean, Mitt Romney, talking about marriage being between a man and a woman, that was surely to appease the Christian right.
Yeah, but maybe that's also more of a Republican position as much as anything else, and more of a conservative issue rather than the religious issue, perhaps. But there's no doubt about it that they've both sort of stayed away from issues which I thought there was going to be a much greater sense of on this campaign.
Yeah, no, absolutely. James, we're going to have a look at The Observer, still talking about the American election, and who's saying that they believe America and the world still need Barack Obama?
Well, I picked this one, and you have to forgive me, it's a bit early to be contentious, but let's see how this plays, all right? Jesse Jackson, sitting here crying his eyes out 4 years ago, the night that Obama got elected. Jesse Jackson's an interesting individual. I don't know how much any of you know about him, but he was someone who was very close to Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he made a whole load of interesting stories about his actions the night King was killed, about how close he was, and how the last thing that Martin Luther King said was to Jesse Jackson. It turned out to be not true at all. So he's got quite an interesting background. And he's basically saying that only the Democrats can deliver upon continued civil rights for African Americans and continue this idea that somehow the Democrats are good for civil rights and Republicans bad for civil rights. And unfortunately, it's just plainly not true. You go back through American history, for example, and it's actually the Democratic Party that begins the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, and who initiate, it's the Republicans who initiate the first civil rights movements in the 1860s. Lincoln, of course, is a Republican, freed the slaves. This idea of portraying the Democrats as being some sort of white knights in terms of race relations and the Republicans as being evil racist is a real fiction that it's very easy to spin here in Europe, and I think there needs to be some sort of a break on this and a balanced opinion on this.
You mentioned the historical facts there, but how is it that history then seems to get rewritten?
Well, this is one of the great interesting things about this. So you come forward to the civil rights movement, which Jesse Jackson rightly refers to here. And we in Europe look at this as though, well, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Democrat, pushed this through. But what most people don't realise is that their greatest opponents to that, the greatest block on getting civil rights legislation through in the 1960s, is actually Southern Democrats, not Republicans. And this continues today. Jackson's here saying, he must be able to go on despite a faltering economy and despite thwarted ambitions. And there's an awful lot of stuff that Obama's doing in terms of his state of the economy, his use of drone strikes, for example, overseas, his continued use of Bush-era policies. That if this is a Republican, you have to say, I doubt that Jesse Jackson will be calling for his re-election at this point.
There must be a reason, though, that the overwhelming majority of African Americans choose to vote Democrat, though, surely.
I think they've bought into this idea that there is, one party in favour or one against, but it's this gulf between reality and perception, and there's no doubt that the Democrats have been very, very good at spinning this, and Republicans need to get an awful lot better publicity and PR people working for them, I think, to try and get across this gulf between what is reality and what is fiction.
They need a history lesson from James.
They do, absolutely. So if anybody's listening, I am available.
Yeah.
So,
Have you met Jesse Jackson by any chance?
I have met Jesse Jackson.
And
I met him in the
conversations have you had?
mid-90s. And it was fascinating. I met him in a poor black community in Washington, D.C., and he rocked up and he'd got the most over-the-top, ridiculous Rolex you've ever seen. He'd got the whole bling thing going on. And I must admit, he wasn't someone... I was working with an African-American group in Washington at that point and having a whale of a time. And he was certainly an interesting character to meet, let me put it that way.